Okay, hi everyone, we're going to get started. So I want to thank you all for coming to what is now the 14th event of the Feminist and Accessible Publishing and Communications Technology Speaker Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum. I'm a professor here at McGill in the IGSF and the creator of this series. So the goal of this series is to bring together speakers in industry and in academia and in activism who are thinking about the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. This series brings forward critical approaches to publishing practices, communication strategies, and techniques for making research dissemination more accessible. Part of the motivation of this series is that while humanities scholars and social science scholars will critique traditional academic publishing and communication strategies as being sexist, classist, racially biased, and inaccessible, the kinds of solutions proffered oftentimes romanticize and fetishize technological alternatives and don't look at how inequity can be perpetuated or shifted, especially at the level of algorithms. As we seek to draw attention to the power relations that have been invisibilized, it's important to think about the space that we're in. We're on unceded territory, and also McGill University has profited by the fact that James McGill had owned slaves. This series was made possible due to a variety of funders. If you want to see the full list, you can look at our website, but the main funders are SSHRC, many different organizations at McGill, including the IGSF, MILA of UDM, Concordia University and UQAM, as well as the Guyon, Montreal's feminist bookstore. Please check out our website and social media. We have 25 events this year. All of them are free and open to the public. Some forthcoming events are Ruha Benjamin, who will be speaking on the new Jim Code, Race After Technology, and Abigail Egohawk on decolonizing data. In case you have any friends or colleagues who weren't able to come to our events, most of our events are filmed and put on our website and are also open and free to the public. So please check out our website. The next two events are, one will be a workshop on public-facing scholarship and website design on November 4th, and then on November 14th, Kate McKenney will be speaking on crisis infrastructures, AIDS activism meets online content regulation. So now for today's event. Dr. Warren Klein is an associate professor in the departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University. She is currently at work on two major projects. The first, Data by Design, which is an interactive book on the history of data visualization, and the second, Data Feminism, which is co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio, which is a trade book that explores the intersections of feminist thinking and data science. She also maintains ongoing research into the application of quantitative methods to the data of early American culture. So I hope you can all join me in welcoming Dr. Warren.
Thanks so much for having me here. Can people in the back hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. I love that this series exists. I am personally happy to be here, but I'm happier that all of you are here for all 25 events. That's a real, it's what a rich array of work that you're going to see and learn about this year. I'm definitely going to check out your video archive, although not my own. That's terrifying. So what I'm going to talk to you about is this project, Data Feminism, and the process of online open peer review that we went through as part of its publication. I'm going to split my talk into two parts, sort of a little bit about the project itself, so you sort of know what we're talking about, and then the second half is going to be about the review process. And I'm going to try to keep it short to get questions from you, because I think a lot of, as we were just talking, a lot of the aspects relating to the review process were sort of interesting but unexpected, and so maybe some of that will come out in some questions and answers that and an exchange that we can have. I did want to start by just talking about my co-author in this project, Catherine D'Ignazio. We are co-authors in every sense of the way. We have our distinct sort of intellectual trajectories, but we have collaborated very intensely on this project. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She recently launched the Data and Feminism Lab at MIT. She's affiliated with the MIT Center for Civic Media. She's an artist, a designer, a software developer, and a mom. This is me. I'm standing here, but in case you want to know a little bit more about some of the things that I'm not talking about today, I work at Emory. I'm jointly appointed between English and a newly established Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods. It's essentially a sort of a fancy data science department. I direct the Digital Humanities Lab, formerly at Georgia Tech, where I worked for a lot of years. It's sort of in transit. I edit the debates in the Digital Humanities book series with Matt Gold. And I also am a writer, author, software developer, mom. That's one of my kids. And I am here to talk to you about this book. So this is really exciting. You guys are the first people to see the cover as a slide. It was finalized on Friday. It's coming out in March from MIT Press. Sort of the process that led us to this point was this website. So in late 2018, we published the first draft of the book online for open peer review on MIT, what was then their sort of new digital scholarly publishing platform called PubPub. I'm going to talk a lot more about this. This is just a screenshot from the website, which remains online, and so you can read about it there too. But I thought, as I said before, I would take the first part of this talk to just sort of introduce the argument of the book and what it is trying to do. So the basic argument goes like this. So in today's world, data is power, right? We hear about big data, we hear about data-driven decisions, machine learning, AI, all of these things. We've heard the phrase data is the new oil, which increasingly there's a lot of pushback against, but I actually really like this metaphor because I think it's really revealing, right? It was coined by a CEO to convey his view of how he thought data had this tremendous potential for power and profit once it was sort of processed and refined, right? But we can just as easily immediately identify the flip side, right? So like people being exploited, the Earth's natural resources being exploited. In the 19th century, this class of oil barons exercising outsized power on everyone else. And the same thing is true of data today, right? So it's powerful corporations and governments who are in control of all this data collection and processing that's going on. And it's regular people who are increasingly becoming disempowered as more and more data is collected sort of about them without their control. So that's the general idea of sort of our view of what is going on with data today. But you know what, these power imbalances are not new, right? So for many people, and especially for Black people, queer people, trans people, other groups, it's just the same old oppression in another form, right? But this is a thing. Because these problems are not new, there actually already is a rich body of work that comes from the past several decades of intersectional feminist activism and critical thought that can model for us how to challenge and attempt to rebalance some of these asymmetries of power. And so, our argument really is that data science needs feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn and sort of rebalance these asymmetries of power. So that's sort of the basic argument of the book. So in writing the book, Catherine and I, we sat down and asked ourselves, what have we learned from all of our schooling, and there's been a lot of it, in feminism and our experiences with various activist communities, and things we know about other people's feminisms. What are these things that we've learned, and how can we distill these into principles that sort of encapsulate what we think some of the most important aspects of intersectional feminism are as they relate to data. And our goal was really to sort of operationalize feminism for data science. And, in a way, some people even have pushed back about that, the idea that we would want to operationalize a really rich set of theories. But, we wrote this book really for people mostly in the field of data science who are sort of aware that they are part of the problem and they sort of want to know how to do better, but don't really know specific things that they can do. And it was interesting. So the title of our introduction is Why Data Science Needs Feminism. And initially, both in our peer review and we actually had an editor look over the book too, and he was like, shouldn't it be both ways? Why data science needs feminism and why feminism needs data science? And we thought about it and we were like, kind of not sure that feminism needs data science. There's some cases in which obviously you can take a data-driven approach to feminist ideas and research questions, but our goal, it was really clarifying for us. This book is not, I think that we are appreciative when people teach it in women and gender studies programs, and in sort of in presumably some of the contexts in which you are encountering some of this other work, but it's a trade book. It's written for, we anticipate a lot of industry people. It's people sort of who are very new to the ideas about feminism. And so the ideas that we present, like you will recognize these from all of your schooling too, but we're really trying to sort of channel them and encapsulate them so that they can really be acted upon in the world. Okay, so what does this mean? Data feminism in action. Okay. So here I'm going to just talk through a couple of examples of these principles and sort of how we see them play out. I'm not going to cover all of them. The book is in fact structured. There's a chapter on each of the principles, and each chapter has a lot of examples. These are just some of our, many of them are actually sort of like the examples that with the sort of like the germ of the idea for each chapter, are the ones that we thought were most resonant, are the ones that sort of got us thinking about all the different ways that you could put this into practice. So I'm going to start with this first. Actually, these are two chapters in the book, but they're related. Examine power and challenge power. And so the motivation for this, again, like you in this room probably are already aware of why this is necessary, but like you only need to read a handful of headlines in the popular press, like pretty much any day, to see like numerous examples of the harmful impacts of data systems. So these are two headlines from 2018. The first about a machine learning driven resume screening system employed by Amazon, which was trained on current Amazon employees. They're like, we want to save some time. We've got all these great workers at Amazon. How about we like train a model on the basis of the resumes of the people we've already hired to tell us who we should screen in the first round of our interviewing system. Like hypothetically, good idea. However, because the good resumes were predominantly male and predominantly white, the system very quickly learned to, for instance, eliminate anyone who had gone to a women's college, and also rejecting anyone with a women's-sounding name. So very, very quickly, they realized that this algorithm was perpetuating on a very legible and causally clear way the inequalities that were already in place at Amazon. Here's another one, which is more complicated. This one is about how facial recognition software only works on white people for a similar reason, right? Because the libraries that train face recognition software are developed mostly by white men, and the images that they feed into the system are majority pale faces and majority men's faces. And the outcome is that they are less good at recognizing faces that deviate from the sort of statistical approximation of what those faces look like. I'm going to sort of get into why it's not like a universal good that we fix the system in a minute. But I just sort of put these up here to say, like examples like these show how that, very, very quickly, if there's not a lot of reflection, existing inequalities and existing biases will be sort of baked into these technical systems and become amplified, right? Like this is not our argument. This has been made by many people. Rupa Benjamin has a great book about this. I'm excited that she's coming to talk to you about it. One of the real issues is that the people doing the design and the implementation of these systems tend to be some of the most privileged and therefore the least equipped to acknowledge and deal with the inequality that they really should sort of take into account as they are building these systems, not sort of attempt to fix them after the fact, right? So that's sort of what the sort of idea of examining power in data science, sort of where we see it, sort of where we see the need. So how can you use data science to challenge power? So on the right, this is a grad student at MIT named Joy Bolamwini, and she's done technical work both to show how those facial recognition systems are, or the data sets that train them are biased. She's done sort of like an intersectional analysis of the image in a range of sort of standard facial detection software libraries that are sort of used, that other platforms are built upon. And she's done a lot of activist work to talk to the companies that seek to use facial recognition software to say hey, you need to think really hard before you decide to use faces as a way to identify people or sort people or to sort of perform any kind of human subject analysis, because very, very quickly, and we know all about this, using these flawed systems in many, many contexts can lead to over-surveillance of certain groups, can lead to punitive and sort of life-changing damages, even if it's just sort of a mistake of the system. And so she also founded something she calls the Algorithmic Justice League, which has tried to get companies to sort of sign on to ethical uses of facial recognition software, and in some cases recognize that they should sort of walk away from these systems that they've helped to design. Behind that, is another instance of using data science to challenge oppression. This is a series of articles done by ProPublica on machine bias. And so what they do is they audit the algorithms that underlie a lot of sort of common systems that we don't necessarily have access to because we see them sort of as, we see them only sort of through their end results, right? So you can see just the headline, this is the most recent one, I did the screenshot last night. It's about Facebook and how Facebook allows you to essentially discriminate, sort of decide who you're going to show your ads to on the basis of gender, race, different categories, and about how obviously like that leads to discriminatory advertising and also opportunities. Like the flip side, right? It's like if you're eliminating certain people from seeing like a coupon or a bonus offer, right? Then like those people don't get access to the good things. Facebook, complicated situation, we can talk about that later. Another thing that ProPublica has done really well is they've audited, and by auditing I mean they sort of like look at the output and then they try to reconstruct it on the basis of, they've sort of tried to, they get a lot of different outputs and then they sort of try to reconstruct the model on the basis of what they see. And they've done amazing work on pre-trial, it's called flight risk, or risk assessment algorithms that sort of are automated systems that sort of read in the user profile of someone who has been charged with a crime and they decide whether or not to keep them incarcerated or to give them an amount that they can pay for bail. And ProPublica was able to sort of find the questionnaire that anyone charged with a crime is required to fill out and realize that like it is horrifically biased. And also they showed that the system is very discriminatory, and as a result of this, ProPublica's reporting actually has pushed certain cities to make their police departments no longer and their court systems not use these systems anymore. And so similar to Joy's work, these are both projects that were sort of intervened in controversial systems, sort of initiated by a small group of people, but all of them have resulted in sort of large scale, in the case of Joy's work, sort of public knowledge about the harms of facial recognition software. In the case of the ProPublica reporting, actual policy changes. And so this is sort of when you sort of focus your data science on issues of oppression, issues of inequality, when you keep this like in your center view, you can start to use data science to push back against data science, right? So these are some of the examples that we talk about how you might challenge power with data science. You know, it's worth saying also that, next slide. Challenging power can be quite simple, right? Like all of us could have made this pie chart. This is a US example, but the point I think is clear, right? So here's this pie chart of male presidents and female presidents from Andy Kirk's The Design of Nothing. And like, lo and behold, there are no women presidents in the United States. Again, so you know, what it takes is an orientation towards issues of inequality, issues of oppression, and sort of being aware of the systems that you are employing, how they might either perpetuate or in turn work against those harms. Okay, so here's one more example. And this is an example that I like because it's not just contemporary. It's an example of how power in data there's always been power in data collection and data visualization and in data-driven decisions, even before we had computers, right? So this is a map from 1940s Detroit. It's a redlining map. I don't know, you can't really see like those little pink blocks, those are in the actual image, those are red. So redlining, I always like to say this because it's always like people sort of it hasn't clicked for people. So redlining, this practice of declaring certain neighborhoods or properties sort of good investments on the part of banks and therefore places where people should be able to get loans easily versus places that are high risk for lending money and therefore people should not be able to get loans in those areas. These practices correlate to along in the United States, they split entirely along racial grounds. So in this map of Detroit, all of the red areas are black neighborhoods in Detroit, and all of the green and yellow ones are white neighborhoods. And when you don't sort of enable homeownership in the United States, it sort of sets off a chain reaction. Well, not doesn't set off, it enters into and perpetuates a chain reaction of inequality that is sort of amplified over time. And the redlining part comes from the fact that people actually used to just draw red lines on maps. These are shaded red, but if you go back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, you'll find all of these maps with red lines drawn on the map. So this is a map that sort of secures power, right? Because it was used, well, not just unreflectively, but deliberately on the part of the all-white Homeowners Lending Corporation, HOLC, right, and some Detroit area business and public agencies in order to sort of like codify racial discrimination along like sort of with data on their side, right? But here's another map of the same area. It was undertaken in the 1970s by a collaboration between two groups, the Detroit Geographical Expedition and Institute, which was a group of academic geographers from mostly Michigan State, but all around the Michigan area, and a team of Detroit neighborhood teenagers led by a local activist named Gwendolyn Warren, who was like, herself only 20-something at the time. She's still around and is doing great work, and you should follow her work. But she was sort of aware of all these inequalities perpetuated on the landscape, and the academic geographers initially approached her and were like, hey, so we want to study your neighborhood. And she was like, no, don't study my neighborhood, work with me and my neighborhood in order to make some change. And so she said, well, one of these real problems is that people are speeding through our neighborhood and running over kids because they want to come in from the suburbs to get to their jobs, and no one is doing anything about this. So how about we work together in order to call attention to this issue so that maybe we can do some change, make some change around this issue. So she was the one who came up with the problem. She was like, this is a problem that I know about because I live here. She involved kids in the neighborhood. She actually, because the researchers were associated with Michigan State, she actually arranged it so that the students could take classes on site in their neighborhood but get college credit for geography classes. So she helped sort of train up a new generation of academic geographic researchers. And similarly, her data collection efforts and her mapping efforts sort of led to change. People paid attention to the issue. There were more resources put into stopping this area, and she wasn't just interested in issues of like speeding drivers. She also did things, and I love this anecdote. She collected samples of gravel from neighborhood playgrounds and picked out the pieces of glass and created a data set that was like, look, our neighborhoods are more dangerous than our playgrounds are more dangerous than other playgrounds. And here's the data, right? I counted like in these like 200 chunks of gravel, I found like 20 pieces of glass versus no pieces of glass in this other playground. So, I really like that example too, because that's an example of like physical data collection and a type of data that you wouldn't necessarily think would be data, and yet it is data, right? It really helped to make change. Okay, so that's sort of an example of examining challenging power with data science. Okay, two more examples and I'll run through these a little bit more quickly. Considering context. So this one comes into play just when you consider all of the data that's sort of in the wild right now. There are all sorts of movements towards sort of open data, making your data public and transparent and accessible. And I teach a text analysis class for data science students right now, and it's true, like my students are finding amazing data to work with, but the problem is that none of this data is introduced with any context around it. So even though you've got the data, you don't really know what you're looking for, right? And this can lead to all sorts of erroneous assumptions and outright wrong conclusions about the data themselves. So here's one example, and this is actually a project that was done by Catherine's students. Sorry, you can't read that well. So this is a project done by a student. She used to teach in a journalism department and teach data journalism. And she had her students look at, in the United States, there's federally mandated reporting on sexual assault on campus as part of what's called the Clery Act. There's sort of like an interesting history about why that is true. But her students, they were located in Boston. There was this data, like you're actually required to be informed anytime there's an incident. So this is something if you work on the US or teach or learn in a university in the US, every time there's an incident on your campus, you're required to get an email. So it's sort of like a thing that students are thinking about all the time, is you get these emails saying an event happened, last night or the other night, we're required to report it. So the students decided to look into these incidents in local schools. And they found out that, and the Clery data is required to be public, they downloaded it, they analyzed it, they made their charts. Boston University, which is a large urban university in a setting actually not dissimilar to McGill, like in the middle of the city, had very low rates of sexual assault on campus. Whereas I believe it was Williams College, which is like a small liberal arts college in a beautiful idyllic setting in Western Massachusetts. There are cows, I think their mascot is a cow. They had a really high rate of sexual assault on campus. And the students, they made their little bar charts and they were like, how could this be? One would think, especially given there had been at the time some local reporting about some high profile, really awful cases in the news that had happened in Boston. Like they sort of knew intuitively this was wrong, but the data was showing them something else. And so they dug into the context and they discovered that Williams had actually put a lot of money and human resources into their reporting mechanism. They thought it was really important. They really wanted to document what the problems were. They created counseling services, a formalized process, all of these different ways that it made it easier for victims to come forward. Whereas BU, because they didn't want people thinking this is a dangerous place to be for women, it did everything possible to discourage reporting, to have students, when they came to say, I want to report this incident, they were discouraged from formally registering their complaint. So if you didn't know the context, you would come up with a very different conclusion about what was going on and where to direct resources, but a little bit of thinking about how the data was collected, who the data is supposed to reflect, the context in which people themselves choose to or choose not to generate data about themselves and their experiences. This can lead to very different sort of versions of the data that you see for analysis. So that's another example. Just a quick example of this, part of considering the context is asking yourself whose interests are being represented in data collection efforts, right? And this is similar to the Clery Act data, but also whose interests are being ignored. So this is a project called Missing Datasets by Mimi Onwoha, who's a New York City-based artist. And she just creates a list of data sets that you would expect to exist because they sort of describe and document urgent social needs. And yet because of institutional will, because of the power structures and the people who are sort of enabled and empowered to collect large data sets, they just don't exist. And so her project is saying like, maybe we should think about the reason why these data are not collected. And if we really care about making large scale change, let's think about the ways in which either using data or not, because another part of the project, much like a lot of these projects, is to say like there are some cases in which data, you don't want to collect data on people because it can actually lead to worse harms if they become datafied, right? But in any case, so this is a really interesting project. This is also online on GitHub. You can Google it. It actually just got a nice shout out in the New York Times yesterday, which is exciting for me. Okay, third principle. Elevate emotion and embodiment. So this is the last one I'm going to talk about. You can read more of that in the book. What does this mean? So, does anyone know what this is? Has anyone seen this before? So this is an equation printed by Edward Tufte, who is the famous sort of data visualization guru. He's been writing these books since like 1970. And I think in the 30-year period when no one was really caring about data visualization, he entered this void and really became like the voice of like how you should design data visualizations at a time when not many other people, if any, were sort of explaining how you should do it. So he sort of coined this equation, this ratio called the data-ink ratio, where he says that ink on the page should only be used to present the data, right? Anything that is not directly presenting the information about the data, that is useless and you should be discouraged from using it. And this led to this sort of like minimalist, modernist aesthetic in data visualization that we see pretty much everywhere today. To the point where if you see something that diverges from that aesthetic, you think it's bad visualization, right? And this is actually like, think about like, this is like a general problem with modernism or sort of like capital in modernism, which many of you, maybe if you're art historians, you also know about. In any case, the really interesting thing is there's been some new research recently that shows how actually, like data or ink expended on things other than the data is actually, it might be okay. This is because people are not just like brain stalks attached to eyeballs, but we are like living, being, feeling bodies in the world. This idea of sort of expending, designing around your data and not just presenting the data themselves is not just more interesting, but it actually helps people remember things. So there have been some really interesting user studies that have shown that, like, if you do charts like this, where the theme is connected to the contents of the data, then people remember it more. Like you ask them a week later, a month later, they have much better recall when there's more than just numbers in their chart. And there's some interesting, that's one citation, but there's a bunch of them that I could point you to if you're interested. This actually came into play in a sort of slightly different context in the most recent US election. I don't know how many of you were looking at the New York Times during the 2016 US presidential election, but what they decided to do was create this, this sort of, it was called a gauge. So it actually worked sort of like a speedometer. It wasn't a static visualization. It actually sort of wiggled over the course of the day. Actually, every time I show this slide, I think I should really get an animated version of it so you can see it. But you can Google it, you can see it. So take my word for it. It was sort of, it was jittery the entire time. People found it incredible, like it was an incredibly polarizing visualization. In online forums, people said it was manipulative, they thought it was unethical, they were like, it made me feel so anxious. How could the New York Times or a designer, why would they try to do this to me? But when you talk to, and actually the designers of the visualization were interviewed and they were like, well, how could you do this to people? And they were like, actually, we believe in it because what we were trying to show was uncertainty. And it turns out that, again, sort of these static, clean methods of conveying uncertainty, whether like sort of margins of error or probabilities, people are really bad at interpreting them. They just like, when we see something static and fixed, we interpret it as static and fixed, and we don't understand that we're dealing with something that is either like a predictive model or a probability or some sort of uncertain calculation that is certainly not fact. And so the designers were like, we were actually going to try to convey a feeling of uncertainty in order to make people realize that what they were looking at was uncertain. And sure enough, the outcome of the election, that was unexpected by most people, but it was actually within the margin of error of the forecast. And so the jittery election gauge actually did a really good job of conveying the uncertainty of the models that the election forecasts were based on, even if people themselves did not want to know that the models were themselves uncertain. So anyway, so those are some of the examples that we talk about in the book, that sort of range from the individual to the collective, the sort of like industry-facing data science to things you can do at your home. We have like examples of people doing murals, of people doing data collection efforts, things like this. So yeah, so these are the other principles. The ones that I didn't talk about were, let's see, rethinking binaries and hierarchies. I feel like I don't need to explain that to this room, but right, feminism is really good at pointing out false binaries and hierarchies that are encoded in those. Embracing pluralism, just sort of this belief that knowledge is not sort of universal and that everyone has a different perspective, and when we come together, we know more. And making labor visible, right? So sort of this commitment to acknowledging all the people and all the work required in order to go into what we perceive to be this sort of clean, finished project divorced from the people themselves. But now I'm gonna shift to sort of talk about the peer review process. And like it's open access week this week, right? I don't know if you are aware of that, but it is. And MIT Press actually interviewed us for, they did like a podcast on open access and this platform. And they, one of the questions, they started out by saying, well, why did you choose to do this? And we kind of had like a not good answer. But I think in large part, it was like, because it was so aligned with our core beliefs, many of which you saw in the principles, that like it was sort of a no-brainer. Right? Like a key tenet of feminist knowledge production is that like, I just said, like no knowledge is universal, all knowledge is incomplete. And that we get to sort of we get the best sense of like what we know by bringing together multiple perspectives. I thought, this is, Joanna Drucker has a really nice encapsulation of this. All knowledge is partial, all knowledge is situated, and all knowledge is historical. So partial meaning what I just said, situated meaning that it's sort of rooted in a particular time and place and set of social conditions, historical meaning historical. In general, she's a great writer and is a great distiller of a lot of digital humanities ideas. So I will recommend that you go to her work. In any case, so it just seemed sort of like this obvious thing to do because we recognized that we were trying to write this book that took all these ideas about feminism as its sort of guiding, as its impetus, and yet we were like two white women with advanced degrees and a lot of kids running around, and we knew our perspective was pretty narrow. And we really wanted to learn from and listen to other people who have been thinking about this and make sure that the book sort of incorporated a lot of, as many additional perspectives as it could. The other thing that I'll sort of say by way of an aside, I had some experience with open scholarly publishing through my work on the Debates in Digital Humanities series. This is a series that is published and has been published since 2012, nearly simultaneously in print physical books, and then in online open access volumes. There's a little bit of a delay between the book and the online version, but it has led to a much greater readership. We believe in making things open and accessible. It's just, there have been no downsides to it. That platform has a comment feature built in, and so I'm sort of where readers can offer either annotate or comment upon the published text. And so I was sort of like familiar with the experience of getting comments of like what people think about the things that I'd written beforehand. Like this is one comment that was like right on and like a little bit critical of something that I'd written, and I was like, okay, that's valid, like good to hear, I'm glad someone said that. And I don't have a screenshot to show, but in the process of writing the volumes, all the volumes undergo what we call a peer-to-peer review process. So they are peer reviewed by the press, but not the individual essays, and instead we create a WordPress instance, although this may be changing to this new platform called Manifold, which I can talk about, where we upload all the drafts of the essays, we assign reviewers certain, the authors of some essays to review other essays. It takes place in using the Comment Press plugin, and so people can comment upon in public, they are required to comment upon and offer feedback in public, or not in semi-public, it's password protected, but among the, we tend to have like 40, 50, sometimes even 60 authors involved in each book. So it creates this community of exchange, and the end effect is that it ends up creating a lot more linkages between the essays themselves because everyone is reading everyone else's essays and they're recognizing connections between them and sort of shifting their arguments and sort of in order to include the contributions of other people in the book. And so I sort of knew that open peer review could be really helpful. But when we asked ourselves, could we really do this with the first draft of a book, which really, we had written, this whole project, Catherine and I met each other maybe in 2016. We hadn't met each other before that, and we decided to write the book maybe in we started writing in January 2017, and we drafted the book in maybe 9 months, but mostly over the summer of 2017, and it was not finished, and we knew there were big gaps. And we knew, especially in terms of inclusive language, which is always changing, we would be making mistakes because we don't know everything, and also what people want to be called. We just knew that there would be a lot of potential. We knew there might be people might take issue with the words that we were expressing as things that were published on the internet, right? And in a standard book writing process, you take the time to do that in private, right? You make mistakes, but people don't see your mistakes. But when we asked ourselves, do we want to do this? Could we really do this? Should we really do this? It was ultimately, we were like, well, our value, we did this value statement, actually, which I'll talk about in a minute. We had come up with this value statement. Actually, let me do that now, because that makes sense. Early in the phases of writing the book, we had crafted this value statement because, Catherine and I, we actually didn't really know each other that well, and I can talk about that later. But we wanted a reference point for, when we had to make decisions about what we would talk about, who we would talk about, which examples we would keep in, which ones we would keep out. We thought it was a good idea to make our values explicit. And so we had this set of values which included a commitment to transparency and reflexivity and accountability. And we were like, okay, if we're really going to live these, we have an ethical obligation to put this book online so that it can be reviewed in public. So I did just make some slides with the values. You could read more about them online. We have more to say about what we mean by these things, but insisting on intersectionality, we thought this was important as to white women to make this explicit. Our goal was to advocate for equity, right? But not just as a goal, but also sort of a process of becoming more equitable. Given this emphasis on equity, we really wanted to emphasize and prioritize those with direct experience of inequality, so that we could learn what the best interventions might be, not sort of coming in from outside and saying this is what you should do, but say like what do communities and individuals want and need, and how can we amplify those. Acknowledging the humanity of data, right? That data is produced by people, about people, it's been wielded against people. In another context, I'm a scholar of the 18th and 19th century United States, which has a lot to do with slavery, and so I'm thinking a lot about sort of the process by which people become reduced to numbers and sort of the violence that is associated with that, so that was sort of an important one to me. And then this final one that I mentioned, that we are reflexive, transparent, and accountable, and just sort of trying to make open our motivations. Along with this, we actually decided to establish metrics that would sort of help us gauge our degree of accountability to these values. This was not the only thing we did to sort of hold ourselves accountable. It wasn't entirely successful, and it certainly wasn't uncontroversial. I can talk about it more a little bit later, but I just wanted to put this slide up there. This is from the page proofs where we had yet to insert our final metrics. Yes, that's what I wanted to say about that. And then just a little bit more about this process. Yes, we put our book up online. We invited several people to serve as like official online peer reviewers. We asked people who we sort of knew, either had experience working in public, either on Twitter or because they were out in the world, because we knew that it would be sort of a big ask for them. It's harder to give comments in public than it is in private. We actually had one person say, I don't want to do this online, but I will give you I will email you my comments, and they did that instead. We invited about 24 other people, some of whom we knew, some of whom we didn't know. Like many of them are people whose work had been really catalyzing for us in the particular chapter. And we invited those people to comment on specific chapters or sort of specific sections of the book. And I should say also, we made MIT pay the full online peer reviewers and would offer free copies of the book to those who had commented on specific sections, because we thought it was really important. Like initially, they had their structure in place for the formal peer review. The book also got formally peer reviewed, and those people, if you've ever done this, you get a credit for books at MIT Press, or they give you $100 or something. But MIT had not considered paying people for the online peer review. We were like, oh no, this is more work. So that was something that we put into place, and those people were compensated, but the rest of the people was totaled. I don't have the metrics on this because it's sort of hidden in the PubPub system, but I would guess it was between 60 to 80 people. There were definitely hundreds and hundreds of comments. It's a little bit hard to sort out who was doing what comments and how many there were, but most of those people just sort of came from the internet, and some of those people turned out to be some of our most thorough readers. There was very little correlation between the people we asked and the people we didn't ask, and then the quality or depth of the comments that they made. Just in terms of I'm not an online only apologist. We actually also had people both print out the website and return to us a printout with line edits and comments on a physical version of the website. And then we also had people do things send us say oh, I read this on my phone, so I couldn't use the comment feature because I was doing one person was doing field work in the Philippines, and she was but I'm writing out a document that is based off of your website. So that was sort of some interesting media formats that the peer review took. And I would say in general, everyone was generous and kind, and it just improved the book immensely. It just made me so, I felt so, I feel academia can be a pretty, it can be a kind of isolating experience sometimes, and you sometimes worry that scholars in their ivory towers sort of aren't always acting in others' interests. but it really sort of like affirmed the best of scholarly and intellectual generosity, and also sort of like the nice things about people on the internet. Like we'd also worried about, like putting a feminist thing on the internet in view of like Gamergate and the way in which, certain other scholars who we knew who were talking about feminism in public really had gotten like significantly and seriously trolled and doxxed and like, worse. In any case, so it all, for the most part, like worked out really well. 5 stars would do again. And I just wanted to close by saying, we're not the only people doing this, right? There's other models both that we borrowed from and that we have learned from and that we have seen since. The values and metrics, the idea to do both values and metrics and do them together came from, Catherine had been involved in a breast pump hackathon earlier where she had worked with a formal diversity consultant named Jen Roberts, who was like, this is what I think that your hackathon needs, and it was on the basis of the productive outcome of that Catherine was like, I think we should do this for this book. I had also taken some inspiration from value statements associated with conferences and DH centers that have increasingly been trying to say, like, why are we collecting together? What do we believe in? How are we later through charters? Like, how are we going to guide our actions? Code of conducts we've seen to really powerful effect in conferences, including, and I should say some of the DH centers doing good work on these value statements are AdHum, which is out of the Maryland Institute for Technology and Humanities, MIF. They have a sort of, one arm of that is African American Digital Humanities, AADHUM. I think I'm missing one letter of the acronym, but they have a really great values statement that they developed in conjunction with their first conference. The Color Conventions Project, which is a DH project, formerly out of the University of Delaware, but has moved to Penn State, has a great set of values around, in particular, the use of their teaching materials and their data set. And there's other the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia has a great charter that they ask grad students to sign when they come on board into the organization. There's other examples of online peer review. Kathleen Fitzpatrick put her entire book online for open peer review through Comment Press. And she was very helpful, in just some of the logistics of like setting it up. She answered a lot of questions for us. And then more recently, there is this, sorry, these slides are just not that, oh, I guess you can see that one, okay. This is the MLA's, it's a volume on digital pedagogy, which I was a contributor to, but I had nothing to do with the structure of it. It went through sort of online comment and peer review, online through this platform, through Humanities Commons, and the comments that you can see, if you click on some of the sections, you can see sort of how that transpired. But then the other thing that they did to deal with state was they actually had contributors submit their work through GitHub, and so you can sort of see the revision history over time. And so that was another interesting thing that they did. There are many, many others out there. I can talk about them more. This has already gone on for like a little bit longer than I wanted to, so I'm going to stop there and just say, okay, so book is out in March 2020. That's the link. The cover is not on the website yet, but you've seen it here already. And if you have questions or comments for us, or you want to add us on Twitter, this is us. So thanks.